May 13th, 1943, outside Bizerte, Tunisia. The desert heat pressed down like a hammer, baking the twisted carcasses of Panzer IIIs and half-tracks until they radiated the bitter scent of burned oil. The air shimmered with heat, and flies gathered in thick clouds around anything that smelled of blood. Feldwebel Hans Kellner sat slumped against the wreckage of a vehicle, his uniform stiff with sweat and grime. His right thigh throbbed with every heartbeat, a deep wound from shrapnel that had torn into him 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks, one bandage. That was all he had. The linen strip had once been white, but now it was black with dried blood and yellow with pus. He had rinsed it in muddy ditch water when he could find some, shaken out the maggots when they became too many, then wrapped it back around the wound. German medicine on the retreat was little more than this: improvisation and desperation. Morphine had disappeared from his unit's supply line before the last winter. Sulfadust had been rationed until the tins went empty. Ether was a rumor. His Luger was still clean. A soldier could always maintain his weapon, even when everything else rotted. Kellner's hand trembled as he lifted it toward the figures coming across the scrub. He had been told the enemy was soft, spoiled by machines, incapable of endurance. Yet these men moved with a confidence his own comrades had long since lost. Helmets caught the light, rifles slung on their shoulders, Red Cross armbands stark against khaki. None of them raised a weapon. The closest dropped to one knee a few feet from him, palms open. He was dark-haired, young, and spoke German with an Italian accent. "Sulfa," he said carefully, lifting a small packet from a pouch. Then another word: morphine, as he showed a sealed glass tube with a metal tip. The pistol wavered in Kellner's grip. He hadn't seen sulfa since El Alamein. Morphine was something his men whispered about but hadn't touched in nearly a year. In the Africa Corps, the last of it had been reserved for officers. For an enlisted man like him, there had never been any. His strength gave out. The Luger slipped into the sand. The medic, Private First Class Angelo Rossini, though Kellner did not know his name, moved quickly, like a man who had done this 100 times. He jabbed the syringe into Kellner's arm, and fire spread through his veins. Moments later came silence, the sharp edges of pain dissolving into nothingness. Kellner's breath slowed, no longer forced through clenched teeth. Orderlies lifted him onto a stretcher, the canvas surprisingly clean against his filthy uniform. A white tag was tied to his tunic. It bore English words he could not read, but one of the orderlies said it aloud: "Immediate surgery." The card swung gently as they carried him toward the aid station. Confusion welled up inside him. He had believed, because he had been told, that Germany was the pinnacle of modernity, its soldiers the best equipped, its industry the most advanced. Yet here, in the hands of his enemies, he was being given drugs and supplies that his own army had not been able to provide in months. Even as a prisoner, he was receiving more care than his comrades dying on the Eastern Front. By mid-1943, a single American infantry platoon carried more morphine syrettes in its aid kits than the Africa Corps Medical Service had distributed to an entire division in the same period. To Kellner, the difference was not a statistic. It was the warmth spreading through his arm, the sudden easing of agony, the feeling of being pulled back from death by strangers in uniforms he had been trained to hate. As the stretcher rose higher, Kellner's eyes fluttered closed. The last thing he saw was his pistol, half buried in the sand. It had been his final symbol of control. Now it lay abandoned, a relic of a fight he could no longer carry on. The Americans carried him away, the tag on his chest marking him not as an enemy, but as a man worth saving. May 14th, 1943, Field Hospital, Feldwebel, Tunisia. The canvas walls of the hospital tent strained against the night wind, lanterns hissed and guttered, and the smell was a mixture of iodine, sweat, and blood that had dried too fast in the desert heat. Feldwebel Hans Kellner lay on a stretcher under a canvas roof that seemed impossibly high after weeks of staring at nothing but sand. He blinked against the light, already drifting on a tide of morphine he had thought extinct, and listened to the strange rhythm of voices around him. Not panic, not shouts, but clipped, ordered commands. Clamp, retract, irrigate. Each word dropped like a hammer strike, precise and final. Major William Harrison, U.S. Army Medical Corps, bent over the wounded German with gloved hands. His face was calm, eyes focused, movements unhurried. He had worked in dozens of these tents since North Africa, and his team was as rehearsed as any infantry squad. To them, Kellner was simply another case to be saved. His uniform did not matter. They moved with machine-like certainty, an anesthetist keeping the mask steady over the German's face, a nurse swabbing sweat from his brow, two orderlies positioning instruments. For Kellner, the silence was the strangest part. He had expected screams, the sound of bone saws biting into flesh, the moans of men forced to bite down on belts while knives cut them open. That had been his memory of German aid stations in Russia, where morphine had run out before the first snow. Instead, here, he heard only the quiet pulse of suction pumps and the rustle of clean bandages pulled from endless rolls. Watching from the side was Dr. Friedrich Steinberg, chief surgeon of the 15th Panzer Division until his capture days earlier. He had been ordered to scrub in, his hands scrubbed raw, and then fitted with American rubber gloves. He stood stiffly, observing procedures that unsettled him more than any defeat. He had worked through nights on the Eastern Front with little more than vodka for disinfectant, amputating limbs with carpenter's saws when surgical blades dulled, rationing sulfa powder until tins were empty. Now he saw more gauze used on one wound than he had used for a dozen men. Harrison reached for a small vial, holding it up for a nurse to draw. The glass glinted in the lamplight. "Penicillin," he said aloud, slowly, as if explaining it. Steinberg's brow furrowed. The word meant little to him. He had heard whispers of a British discovery years earlier, but in Germany it had remained rumor, a curiosity. Here it was injected casually, as if it were as common as saline. Steinberg felt his chest tighten. He thought of comrades he had lost to sepsis, men who had died raving with fever because sulfa powder had been gone since '42. If what the American claimed was true, if this penicillin worked as it seemed, then he was standing at the edge of a medical revolution his own nation had ignored. The procedure continued with almost industrial precision. Instruments gleamed, sterilized in an autoclave that hissed outside the tent, its steam venting into the cool night. Blood plasma dripped steadily from glass bottles, clear tubing carrying life into the German prisoner. Every detail spoke of abundance. Even the sutures were fresh, not boiled catgut reused until it frayed. Every hand was steady, every motion practiced. Harrison stepped back at last, stripping off his gloves. "He'll live," he said, voice quiet but certain. There was no triumph in it, no boasting. It was simply fact. Another man, another life preserved. Steinberg felt something hollow in his chest. He had been chief surgeon of a division that once carried Rommel's banner. Thousands of men had depended on his skill. Yet in this tent, under these lights, with these supplies, he felt like nothing more than a butcher who had been pretending to be a doctor. His nation had told him it was the pinnacle of science and discipline. Yet here, the Americans casually performed miracles with resources they seemed to consider endless. Outside, trucks rumbled up with more crates stamped Medical Department, U.S. Army. Inside them were fresh gloves, new gauze, more morphine, and more of that mysterious clear liquid called penicillin. Supplies enough for thousands. Supplies enough even for their enemies. Steinberg turned away from the table, peeling off the gloves. He whispered in German, barely audible under the hiss of lanterns. "Sie haben alles. Wir haben nichts." They have everything. We have nothing. And with those words, he understood that the war he thought he had been fighting was already lost. June 1943. Hospital ship, Atlantic crossing. The salt air carried the sharp tang of disinfectant as stretchers clattered up the gangway of the white-painted vessel. Huge red crosses blazed on her hull, symbols so large they could be seen from miles away. For Feldwebel Hans Kellner, half awake on morphine, the sound of boots on steel and the low thrum of engines felt unreal. He had expected captivity to mean cages, chains, or worse. Instead, he was being carried onto a hospital ship where the wards gleamed with white enamel and brass polished to a shine. The air inside smelled not of sweat and sickness, but of carbolic acid, bleach, and linen. 3 bunks were stacked high in each ward, each bed with a wool blanket folded squarely across it. Germans and Americans lay side by side, both wounded and both treated alike. Nurses in white smocks moved between them, carrying trays of glass bottles, cotton rolls, and syringes that never seemed to run out. Every instrument gleamed. Every bandage was new. Across the ward shuffled a 19-year-old Afrika Korps gunner named Willie Becker, his jaw swollen grotesquely from abscessed teeth. He had not seen a dentist since 1940. Within hours, a Navy doctor had lanced the abscess, cleaned the infection, and filled cavities with silver amalgam. Becker nearly cried when they handed him a small orange afterward, the first fresh fruit he had tasted since before the desert campaign. He held it to his nose, breathing in the clean citrus scent, unable to believe something so simple could feel like a miracle. The shock was not just in the care itself, but in its excess. Bandages were used once and burned. Needles came in sterile packs, discarded after a single use. Blood plasma hung in glass bottles, lined up like ammunition cartridges, ready for transfusion. The Americans treated even minor cases with the same precision and abundance. For men who had grown used to belts stuffed into mouths during surgery, the idea of anesthesia for a tooth extraction seemed absurdly luxurious. The voyage across the Atlantic was not silent. Men moaned, coughed, sometimes cried out in the night, but they were always answered by a nurse's hand on the shoulder, by medicine pressed into a vein, by voices speaking calmly. There was food 3 times a day, bread soft and white instead of coarse and gray, coffee rich and steaming instead of the bitter ersatz sludge the Germans had drunk for years. Some of the prisoners whispered that this was not real, that it was a trick, that the Americans were fattening them for something worse. But the days passed, and the treatment never changed. When the ship docked on the American coast, hospital trains were waiting. Pullman cars had been converted into wards with padded bunks, clean sheets, and attendants riding in every carriage. Even before reaching the camps, every prisoner was vaccinated against typhus, smallpox, and tetanus. To Germans accustomed to months without proper medical supplies, the idea of being inoculated for diseases that were routine in the Wehrmacht trenches seemed like science fiction. One American orderly explained casually that every soldier, prisoner or not, was checked, weighed, charted, and given whatever treatment was needed before being sent on. The paperwork alone filled binders. For Becker, the astonishment lay not only in the injections and the dental work, but in the fact that his name, his age, his exact weight, and his health were now recorded in neat English handwriting. He was no longer just a number shouted by a sergeant. He was a patient with a file. A single American hospital train carried more blood plasma than the entire German army had produced for the Eastern Front in 1943. For the prisoners lying in bunks as the wheels clattered over rails, the fact was not a statistic, but a sensation. The cool drip of plasma into a vein, the easing of fever, the return of strength. Becker sat with the orange peel in his lap, staring out the narrow window as the American countryside rolled past. Fields green instead of barren, barns full instead of empty. He tried to write his mother, his pencil scratching on thin camp stationery. Dear Mutti, I am alive and well cared for. He stopped, knowing the censor's black ink would blot out anything more. How could he explain to her that captivity had given him more comfort in a week than his own army had in 3 years? The train rumbled on, carrying its cargo of wounded men toward camps deep in the American heartland. For Kellner and Becker, the journey had already begun to dissolve the certainty of German superiority. The Red Cross on the hull had been the first sign, the orange in Becker's hand the second, Every mile west carried them further from what they had known, deeper into a revelation they could not yet put into words, that the enemy had so much they could afford to be kind. July 1943, Kansas. The wind across the Kansas plains carried the scent of wheat and hot earth, a smell alien to men who had last known only sand and smoke. Barbed wire fences stretched in neat lines, their posts driven deep into prairie soil. Beyond them, rows of wooden barracks stood at parade ground intervals, each painted with fresh white numbers. At the center of this orderly geometry rose a building unlike any Kellner or Becker had expected to find in captivity, a hospital. Whitewashed walls, clean windows, electric lights. The German prisoners shuffled through its doors in disbelief. A hospital in a prison camp. For enemies. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and soap, not of sweat and decay. The floorboards shone with polish. Beds were lined with crisp sheets, 177 in all. There were operating rooms with lamps bright enough to banish every shadow, sterilizers hissing with steam, sinks that ran hot water on command. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Doc Claiborne, West Point graduate turned medical officer, moved through the wards with a clipboard tucked under one arm. His orders were explicit. German prisoners were to receive the same medical care as American soldiers. Geneva Convention standards, enforced not just on paper, but in practice. His staff, doctors, nurses, technicians, treated malaria, dysentery, and infected wounds as though the patients were their own countrymen. Kellner, leg-bound in plaster, was wheeled past rooms filled with medicines he did not recognize. Shelves sagged with sulfa drugs, morphine syrettes in cardboard cartons, vials of quinine for malaria, ampules of insulin for diabetics, and, most astounding of all, bottles of penicillin, stacked as if endless. For months he had believed such supplies were rare treasures. Here they were dispensed as routinely as water. 19-year-old Willie Becker, whose jaw still ached from surgery aboard the ship, was issued a toothbrush, a bar of soap, and clean towels. The toothbrush struck him most of all. In his unit, dental hygiene had been an afterthought, and his teeth had rotted under years of neglect. Now, in captivity, he found himself sitting in a dental chair under the bright glare of an X-ray machine. The dentist spoke little German, but the meaning was clear. Open wide, hold still. Becker's astonishment grew when he realized anesthesia was used even for the smallest filling. Dr. Friedrich Steinberg, once chief surgeon of the 15th Panzer Division, walked the wards as both prisoner and observer. He could not hide his disbelief. He watched American nurses unwrap sterile bandages and discard them after a single use. He saw prisoners immunized against diseases that had cut swaths through Wehrmacht ranks without mercy. He saw men with chronic conditions, diabetes, tuberculosis, placed on special diets and monitored closely. In his own army, such men had been written off as burdens, fated to die. Everywhere he looked, there was abundance, not just of supplies, but of care, of attention, of time. A prisoner with frostbitten fingers from Russia was given physical therapy to restore use of his hands. Another, with a badly set fracture from Tunisia, was operated on again, the bone rebroken and reset properly. These were procedures that had been denied them as free men in uniform, but now offered freely as captives. Claiborne recorded the daily tallies with clinical precision. Each operation noted, each medicine dispensed, each diet logged. He understood the irony. Many American civilians, especially in poor or segregated communities, could not dream of this level of treatment. Yet here it was extended to enemy soldiers. He did not speak of it often, but it weighed on him. Outside, the wheat bent in the summer wind, whispering against the fences. For the prisoners inside, it seemed the world had turned upside down. They had entered America expecting cruelty, punishment, starvation. Instead, they found a medical system that not only preserved their lives but restored them to health. In July 1943 alone, the hospital at Camp Concordia dispensed more antibiotics than the entire German Army Medical Service managed to distribute to its Eastern Front divisions in the whole of 1944. To the prisoners, that staggering fact was not a number on a page. It was the warmth of clean sheets under their backs, the sting of a fresh injection in the arm, the dizzy relief of anesthesia taking hold before a drill touched a tooth. Becker lay awake one night listening to the prairie wind hum against the walls. He stared at the ceiling beams, trying to reconcile the Germany he had fought for with the America that now treated him better than his own country ever had. He whispered a line he could never send in a letter home. "Here, we are men again." August 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The Texas sun hammered the camp like a blacksmith's forge, the air thick with the scent of mesquite and dust. German prisoners, many still in Afrika Korps uniforms patched with American thread, were marched past long rows of barracks toward the camp hospital. The building was larger than any aid station they had known in Tunisia, its corridors echoing with the clatter of gurneys and the clipped orders of American nurses. Inside, the sight that most unsettled them was not the technology, nor the endless cabinets of supplies, but the waste. Bandages used once and thrown away. Needles opened, used, and dropped into bins. Gauze stained with a few drops of blood, burned in barrels behind the wards. To men who had boiled rags until they disintegrated and reused them until they smelled of rot, this was incomprehensible. One whispered to another, "They have so much they can throw it away." Private Karl Heinemann, captured near Tunis with shrapnel scars still raw on his chest, stood watching as an American orderly unwrapped a fresh roll of bandage, applied it to his wound, and then tossed the leftover strip into the trash. Heinemann stared at it, thinking of comrades who had died for lack of that same strip. In Russia, he had watched men bleed into rags already soaked through, their only hope that frost might numb the pain. Now he was being bandaged with material discarded like scraps. Dr. Friedrich Steinberg kept his journal hidden under his mattress, scribbling with a stub of pencil. He noted every impossibility, the surgical gloves worn once and burned, the syringes discarded after a single use, the antiseptics poured freely. Each observation was written in tight German script, as if recording a natural wonder he could not explain. He calculated that a single American ward had used more gauze in a day than his division had received in a month. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Doc Claiborne knew the prisoners watched in disbelief. He also knew what the numbers said. The United States was producing medical supplies on a scale unmatched in history. In 1943 alone, American factories produced nearly 2 billion bandages, 200 million doses of sulfa drugs, and millions of morphine syrettes. It wasn't waste. It was abundance weaponized, an industrial system so vast it could afford to use enemy soldiers as proof of principle. In the dental clinic, Willie Becker sat stiffly in a chair, the hum of the X-ray machine filling the room. The dentist nodded, took his films, and then began to drill, silver amalgam filling his cavities one by one. When Becker asked haltingly what would happen to the old drills and files, the assistant shrugged. "We replace them." Becker almost laughed. In his unit, a single drill bit had been shared by hundreds of men, dulled to uselessness long before it broke. Here, even prisoners had fresh tools applied to their teeth. The word began to spread among the prisoners. The Americans did not just have enough for themselves. They had more than enough for their enemies. It wasn't mercy alone. It was proof. Proof that their enemies' factories and farms poured out such staggering output that even waste exceeded German supply. At night, Becker sat on his bunk writing a letter home, though he knew the censor would carve it apart. "We are treated well," he wrote, then crossed it out. No words could capture the dissonance. He thought of his comrades still fighting in Italy and on the Eastern Front, patching their wounds with whatever cloth they could tear from dead men, while here in Texas, enemy soldiers walked about with fresh white dressings every morning. The barrels behind the hospital burned constantly, smoke rising into the sky. For the Americans, it was the ordinary disposal of medical waste. For the prisoners, It was the visible symbol of defeat, a nation so rich it could throw away what Germany's soldiers died begging for. Claiborne looked at those fires with a different eye. He understood that no propaganda leaflet could do more to undermine the enemy's will than the simple fact of those flames. Every German who saw them would carry the memory home, and with it, the unspoken message. America had more. More drugs, more doctors, more everything. Enough to heal their enemies better than Germany could heal its heroes. September 1943, Camp Clinton, Mississippi, the first-time doctor. Friedrich Steinberg heard it. He thought the American officer had misspoken. Penicillin. The word sounded almost foreign to the ear, like something out of a laboratory dream. But there it was, written on the vial in neat block letters. Penicillin G sodium. Clear liquid, nothing more, but treated with a reverence that told him it was no ordinary drug. In Germany, sulfa powders had been rationed until the tins ran dry. By 1942, wounded soldiers on the Eastern Front were dying by the thousands from infections that spread faster than amputations could stop them. Steinberg had amputated more legs with a carpenter's saw than he cared to remember, the sound of the blade on bone forever etched into his mind. Some men survived, most did not. When the wounds turned black and fever took hold, there was nothing left but prayers and morphine, if morphine could be spared at all. Now, in an American camp hospital in Mississippi, he watched an orderly draw the mysterious liquid into a syringe and press it into the arm of a feverish POW with a bullet wound in his abdomen. The young man's pulse was weak, his skin gray, his breaths shallow. In Steinberg's old world, he would have been marked expectant, a soldier too far gone to waste supplies on. But here, within days, the fever broke. The wound, instead of rotting, knit itself closed. The boy lived. Penicillin, a word that did not exist in German field medicine. Feldwebel Hans Kellner, his leg still in plaster, experienced it firsthand when his wound threatened to turn septic. He had seen comrades die screaming when the red streaks of infection climbed their veins. He braced for the same end. Instead, he was given injections morning and evening. The swelling eased, the pain lessened. The fever never came. He stared at his leg in disbelief, whispering that it should have been cut off. But the Americans had saved it. Even Willie Becker, too young to fully grasp the scale of what he was witnessing, understood the miracle. He overheard German doctors arguing in their own tongue late at night in the ward. They whispered that penicillin could reduce mortality from deep wounds to a fraction of what they knew. They whispered that if Germany had possessed this drug in 1941, the winter in Russia might have gone differently. Becker clutched his blanket tighter, realizing for the first time that the Reich's defeat might not just be on the battlefield, but in the laboratories and factories it never built. Claiborne kept meticulous records. In August alone, Camp Clinton had dispensed thousands of doses of penicillin to prisoners, saving men who would otherwise have been lost. The irony did not escape him. America was not only healing its enemies, but it was doing so with a weapon of science Germany had failed to claim. He knew the scale was staggering. By D-Day, American industry would be producing enough penicillin to treat every Allied soldier in Europe. Germany, for all its vaunted science, produced none. Steinberg filled page after page in his secret journal. "The Americans possess a drug that prevents infection," he wrote. "They waste nothing of life. They are not only rich, they are years ahead." He calculated grimly that one American field hospital likely used more penicillin in a month than the entire Wehrmacht had ever laid eyes on. One evening, as the cicadas droned outside the camp, Steinberg spoke to Claiborne across the ward. His English was halting, but the weight of his words was unmistakable. "In my army, we cut off the leg. Always. No other choice. Here, you save it. With this medicine, it is impossible." Claiborne only nodded. "Not impossible, doctor. Just American." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. For Steinberg, the revelation was complete. The Reich had taught him that German science was unmatched. But here, in captivity, He saw the future carried in vials of clear liquid and dispensed freely even to prisoners, a future Germany would never touch. Winter 1943 to 44, Camp Concordia, Kansas. Snow dusted the Kansas prairie, soft and dry, swirling against the barbed wire fences that cut the horizon into neat rectangles. Inside the barracks, German prisoners hunched over wooden tables, pencils scratching on thin sheets of camp-issued stationery. The stoves rattled with coal heat. Outside, guards paced, their boots crunching on frozen earth. The letters were censored, everyone knew that. Anything that hinted at treatment too favorable, anything that could embarrass Berlin, would be sliced away by American or German censors before reaching home. Yet still, the words slipped through. Fragments, hints, truths, hidden between lines. "We are alive," they wrote. "We are well cared for. The food is sufficient. Medical help is available." Feldwebel Hans Kellner, his leg mending under plaster and penicillin, sat with his pencil poised, unsure what he could say. His mother had last seen him limping through Bremen in 1942, already scarred from Russia. What would she think if he told her he had received better care in captivity than in his own army? He stared at the page, wrote simply, "My wound heals well. You must not worry." It was all he dared. Willie Becker, 19, struggled with the same conflict. His jaw no longer ached. The American dentist had filled his cavities and extracted rotten teeth without pain. He thought of the comrades he had left behind in Tunisia, their mouths ruined, their bodies unwashed, their wounds dressed with scraps. How could he write his mother that in America he ate oranges, drank fresh milk, and had new bandages every day? He tried. "The doctors here are thorough." He left it at that, ashamed and grateful all at once. But words have a way of traveling beyond the censor's intent. A line here, a phrase there, slipped past the black ink. German families read between the words. They heard of sons who gained weight in captivity while their brothers at the front starved. They read of fevers broken, of teeth repaired, of wounds healed. Letters carried the scent of abundance, even when scrubbed clean. Dr. Friedrich Steinberg watched this process with the eye of a scientist. He noticed the morale among prisoners shifting. Men no longer despaired as they had in Tunisia. They wrote home with something dangerous: hope, and hope spread faster than disease. He knew, though the men didn't say it aloud, that mothers in Germany were starting to whisper the unthinkable, that perhaps capture was not the worst fate, perhaps surrender was survival. Claiborne, always meticulous, recorded statistics in his reports. In Camp Concordia alone, more than 4,000 prisoners had received dental procedures, 1,200 had undergone surgery, and not a single death from infection had occurred in 6 months. Across the U.S., the numbers multiplied into the tens of thousands. Mortality among German POWs in American camps hovered around 0.15%, so low it defied belief. Meanwhile, Wehrmacht soldiers on the Eastern Front died in the hundreds of thousands, not just from bullets but from frostbite, dysentery, and untreated wounds. One evening, as snow rattled the windows, Becker whispered to Kellner, "If my brother knew how we lived here, he would throw down his rifle." Kellner said nothing, but the thought lodged deep. And indeed, word spread. Not in official broadcasts, but in the quiet voices of families who shared their sons' letters in villages, in church pews, in factory lines. Rumors took on life. Captured men were not starving. They were healthier than before. Some said they were being fattened for propaganda. Others insisted it was true. Either way, it ate at German morale. By early 1944, reports reached Wehrmacht officers. Desertions were rising. Some units saw rates climb fourfold. Men who might once have fought to the death now weighed their chances, die in a frozen trench, or live under a roof in America where the bandages were always clean. A single American camp hospital in Kansas had performed more surgeries in a year than the entire German Medical Corps could supply for an army group on the Eastern Front. To the men writing home, this statistic was invisible. But the consequences of their letters, their restrained admissions of survival, were felt in the cracks spreading through the Wehrmacht's will to fight. The snow fell steadily that winter night, soft on the roofs of barracks, muffling the sound of the prairie wind. Inside, Becker folded his letter, sealing it with hands that no longer trembled from infection. He whispered to himself words he would never send home. They heal us better than our own did. How can we keep fighting them? Spring 1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The trucks came at dawn, tires crackling over gravel, exhaust hanging in the cool air like breath. On their tailgates, the stenciled words looked as ordinary as fence posts: Medical Department, U.S. Army. But to the men in the hospital, they might as well have read Deliverance. Crates thudded to the loading dock, crowbars squealed under nails, and the smell of fresh pine mixed with carbolic as lids levered free to reveal the day's cargo. Gloves wrapped in paper like loaves of bread, gauze packed in white bricks, enamel trays nested like dishes, and rows upon rows of glass vials winking under straw. Staff Sergeant James Detroit Washington checked the manifest with a pencil tucked behind one ear. He ran a ward the way a crew chief runs a flight line: quiet, relentless, precise. Beds counted, bandages tallied, doses recorded. He had learned medicine in a segregated training school, where secondhand manuals still smelled of other hospitals. Yet here, he commanded a world of new things: sterilizers that sang, suction pumps that purred, autoclaves that exhaled like steam engines. The enemy lay in these beds, men who had fought under the palm tree badge of the Afrika Korps, men who had cursed his country. Washington's hands did not hesitate. He cut through the twine on a crate of catgut sutures and handed the receipt to a corporal. Inventory to pharmacy. 2 boxes to ward. His voice was easy, low, all business. When a German orderly came forward, Washington nodded toward the scales. Weigh the boxes. Write it down. We don't lose count. Inside the ward, the day unfolded on schedule with the same odd serenity that still took prisoners by surprise. An X-ray van, lead-lined, humming like distant bees, had arrived before breakfast, its generator coughing to life behind the laundry. The technician slipped plates into the machine, guided ribs and forearms into frame, and called out seconds while the exposure meter ticked. The big lamp warmed the air, and the faint scent of ozone mingled with disinfectant. Film slid into developer trays the way photos slide out of memory, shadow bones growing out of darkness, fractures clear as map lines. Dr. Friedrich Steinberg stood over a set of 3 images clipped to a light box. An ulna shattered across the distal third, a tibia that had knit wrong under Tunisian dust and desperation, a shoulder that would not stop dislocating because a cartridge had gone through it and no one had had time for proper repair. He didn't need a translator to follow the plan. The American surgeon pointed with his pen. Re-break, align, pin. It would hurt, but it would heal. Washington prepped a patient with deft, economical movements. His gloved fingers were gentle on the German's forearm as he painted it with iodine that glowed like old varnish. He had seen that look 1,000 times. The wary flinch when a POW realized the man with the needle was a black non-com. The flinch passed. In this room, the routine swallowed everything else. Pressure cuff hissing. Ether mask lowered. The slow fall of breath into sleep. The operating theater filled with the soft percussion of instruments, the rattle of clamps, the crisp snip of wire cutters, the hiss of suction. In a corner, the autoclave clicked down from its cycle. 15 pounds per square inch at 250 degrees, a steady drumbeat that promised sterility. Outside, a burn barrel muttered as yesterday's dressings turned to ash. The fire bothered the prisoners, Steinberg had noticed. It announced in smoke what the supply train proclaimed in wood and glass, that the Americans used once and discarded, not from carelessness, but from principle. At midday, Washington crossed the yard to the prosthetics shop, where the air smelled of hot leather and sawdust. A machinist in rolled sleeves rasped the inside of a socket. testing the fit on a prisoner whose hand had gone to a shell burst at Kasserine. The armature, aluminum, light as a rib, would be swaddled in harness and straps, weighted where it needed to swing true. In the corner, a lathe threw off a silver ribbon, curling onto the floor like a little river. Physical therapy charts on the wall set out the millimeters gained each week, line by incremental line. A limb would be taught to remember motion. A man would be taught to trust it. The numbers lived on Washington's clipboard. Dressings changed twice daily, 100% compliance. Post-op fevers measured and logged. Anything above 101 flagged for physician review. Dental procedures completed, 47 this week. Radiographs exposed, 72 plates, 0 retakes for positioning. The figures steadied him. They were proof that order could be built one task at a time, that you could march infection backward with nothing more glamorous than hot water, clean hands, and a schedule kept like a promise. He knew the disparities as well as Steinberg did. In some German battalions, one doctor cared for 2,000 men and boiled instruments in a mess tin. Here, one ward had its own sterilizer and a pantry of replacements. He also knew what the prisoners whispered at lights out, that the Americans had so much they could afford to be kind. Washington didn't argue the point. He threaded an IV, watched the flashback rise clean and red, and wrote the time in the margin. Mercy, he had learned, was a system as much as a sentiment. Systems required parts, rubber, glass, steel, cotton, and a nation willing to make all of it again tomorrow. That afternoon, a fresh convoy nosed through the gate, engines idling while guards checked the manifests. Pharmacy boys jogged out with dollies. The sun threw hard, square shadows across the dock. When the crates were opened, Steinberg stood back and let the sight wash over him. More penicillin, neat in rows, more gloves, size 7 and 8, more gauze, more plaster, more of everything. It was like watching rain refill a reservoir that never seemed to drop. He thought of a winter station near Kharkov, where bandages were wrung out and hung on lines like laundry, where a boy had begged him not to cut, and he had cut anyway because infection would not wait. In this Kansas hospital, the equation had been inverted. Raw material first, human cost second. The inversion didn't make the Americans sentimental. It made them unstoppable. By evening, the ward settled into its low hum. The X-ray van powered down. The burn barrel sighed out. A fresh set of linens was folded at the foot of each bed, corners square, weight reassuring in the hand. Washington walked his line, touching charts with a fingertip, counting breaths in sleeping men. Outside, the prairie wind worried the wire and moved on. He clicked his pen and signed off the day. Behind him, Steinberg closed his journal and watched the last light of the sun stripe the floor. He had not written the word defeat. He did not need to. It was there in the arithmetic of crates and the quiet of the ward, in the way a nation's factories became engines of mercy, and those engines never, ever ran dry. Late 1944, Washington, D.C. and the German fronts. In Washington, the reports landed like artillery strikes, quiet on paper, deafening in implication. 425,000 German prisoners treated in American camps, 15,000 surgeries, 1.2 million dental procedures, mortality rate, under 0.2%. Clerks typed the numbers with the precision of accountants, unaware they were tallying a weapon more destructive than any tank column. Across the Atlantic, German doctors wrote their own reports. Sulfa rations exhausted. Amputation primary procedure. No plasma available. They spoke of tents pitched in mud, bandages reused until they fell apart, and morphine so scarce, men bit bullets as saws cut their bones. In Russia, infection killed more men than Soviet shells. But letters crossed the wire. POWs in Kansas and Mississippi wrote home that they were alive, healing, even gaining weight. Their words slipped through censors. The doctors are thorough. My wound is healing. The food is sufficient. Mothers read between the lines, realizing their sons were safer in enemy hands than in German hospitals. Rumors spread across towns and barracks. Surrender west, and you lived. Surrender east, and you vanished. Desertions multiplied. Entire platoons wavered, men whispering that captivity meant survival. The impossible statistic: America dispensing more penicillin in 1 month than the Wehrmacht possessed in a year, filtered into the German ranks not as numbers, but as stories of comrades returning home with legs intact, teeth repaired, fevers broken. For Feldwebel Kellner, alive on a leg that should have been lost, the guilt was unbearable. His comrades had died with blackened wounds while he walked because his captors had more medicine than his own army. For Becker, the boy turned prisoner, the letters he wrote felt like treason. His life was proof that Germany's promises were lies. By winter 1944, German commanders understood the silent collapse. Men no longer fought with desperation. They fought with the knowledge that survival meant capture. The numbers, cold, precise, unarguable, had broken faith in the Reich. December 1945, Washington, D.C. Victory was celebrated with parades and bands, but in quiet War Department offices the reckoning came in ledgers. The prisoners of war, medical statistics binder, told a different kind of triumph. 425,000 Germans treated, less than 1,000 dead. Mortality rate, 0.15%. American officers knew this was more than compliance with the Geneva Convention. It was a demonstration of abundance as strategy. Camp Concordia's 177-bed hospital now stood empty, the smell of disinfectant lingering in the wood. Guards walked its silent corridors, remembering the disbelief on POW faces when bandages were replaced daily, when X-rays revealed fractures, when dental drills hummed. To prisoners, the smoke of burn barrels symbolized defeat. America could throw away what Germany's soldiers had died begging for. Staff Sergeant James Detroit Washington, back in Michigan, remembered the irony bitterly. He had treated men who wore swastikas while his own family in Detroit had been denied access to white hospitals. Yet he also remembered the order, the precision, the way fevers broke and wounds healed under a system that never ran short. Mercy was a routine, and it worked. Returned POWs told their families the truth in fragments. I came back healthier than I left. They saved my leg. I saw medicine I'd never seen before. Their stories laid the foundation for something larger: trust. Trust that America could afford to be humane, even to its enemies. The ledger of mercy proved that victory was not just a matter of tanks and planes. It was a matter of bandages, plasma, and compassion, mass-produced at industrial scale. The figures were cold, but they told a blazing truth. Democracy's factories had defeated the Reich in silence, one healed prisoner at a time. 1946 to 1949, Germany rebuilding. The POWs returned to a Germany of rubble and hunger. They stepped off trains carrying suitcases of cardboard, wearing patched uniforms, and speaking of impossible things: clean beds, orange juice, dentists who filled teeth, doctors who healed infections with a clear liquid called penicillin. Families listened in silence, stunned that captivity had brought survival. Becker came home at 22, teeth repaired, body whole. His neighbors, still rationing bread, could scarcely believe his stories. Kellner limped home on a leg America had saved, while his comrades lay in graves because Germany had no drugs left. Steinberg returned with notebooks full of observations, teaching young German doctors about sterilization, antibiotics, and the systems he had seen across the ocean. They became unintentional ambassadors. No leaflet could have done what their living bodies testified. The enemy had outproduced not just tanks, but miracles. Mothers repeated that their sons had come home healthier than when they left. Across villages, a dangerous truth spread. America was not barbaric. America was abundant. In Washington, the Marshall Plan was drafted. Billions would rebuild Europe, but the groundwork was already laid in German kitchens where families believed American promises. If the enemy had healed their captured sons, perhaps they truly meant to rebuild the nation. The paradox was undeniable. The Reich had demanded loyalty through fear, but America had earned trust through mercy. The returned prisoners, scarred and healed, carried the seeds of post-war alliance in their bones. 1955, a decade after. 10 years on, the dust of war had settled into memory. The numbers lived in archives, the statistics filed away. Billions of units of penicillin produced, $500 million spent on enemy care, millions of dressings discarded after a single use. What looked like waste to German eyes had in fact been the arsenal of democracy applied to healing. Becker, now William Baker, dentist in Kansas, treated American children with the skills he had first glimpsed as a POW Steinberg, lectured in Hamburg about antibiotics, telling students that what seemed wasteful had in fact saved thousands. Kellner worked in a factory, raising children on a leg the Reich would have cut away. Washington, in Detroit, bore the contradiction of having healed Nazis more thoroughly than his own segregated hometown would treat him. The lesson endured. America had proven that compassion backed by industry could reshape enemies into allies. POW camps had become the first test sites of the Marshall Plan, demonstrating in microcosm what abundance could accomplish. Mercy had been wielded like a weapon, but not one of destruction. It shattered Nazi ideology more completely than bombs. It convinced a generation of Germans that America's strength lay not only in its firepower, but in its capacity to heal. By 1955, as the Cold War settled in, that memory lingered, that in their darkest hour, America had shown such wealth of resources it could afford to be kind, even to its enemies. And in that kindness, it won not only the war, but the peace.